Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Okay, well, welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil, and this time I'm starting a little bit of a new series I'm doing here on creation and evolution issues, and I've got back with me again Micheal Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, who I talked to way back in, I think it was January, on Heaven and Hell, and it's a pleasure to have him back on here. He's got a very successful apologetics YouTube channel, which just recently surpassed 100 subscribers, so he's doing very well, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So thanks for coming on, Micheal. How are you doing this evening?
Good, I'm doing great, and I think you mean 100,000 subscribers.
Did I say 100? I meant 100,000. My mistake.
I was like, whoa, 100, man.
Yeah. Well, if it makes you feel better, I don't think the YouTube channel I have even has 10 subscribers because I don't really do anything with it. So
That's okay.
Yeah, I meant to say 100,000. My apologies. So before we get going, do you have any upcoming projects or new video releases you're going to be doing recently that you'd like to just go ahead and plug right from the get-go here?
Yeah, right now I'm working on a series on commentary on Genesis 1 through 11.
Mm-hmm.
So I just uploaded the video for Genesis 2. Next month I'll upload a video on Genesis 3, specifically regarding who the serpent was. And by the end of the year, before 2020, I should have everything up Genesis 1 through 6 up. And then by the probably well before 2021, I'll have everything on Genesis 1 through 11 up. So that's what I'm working on now. I'm going to get distracted a little bit here and there because I have other videos I want to do as well.
Mm-hmm.
But ideally, I'm going to get this series on Genesis 1 through 11 up, which has been pretty successful so far.
Yeah, I've watched many of those, and I wouldn't necessarily say you totally convinced me, but you definitely present a very compelling and coherent case for the interpretations that you're making for it, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on to talk about these issues. Yeah. And I can totally identify with getting distracted too. I did a whole long series on the problem of divine foreknowledge where I interviewed all the 5 major perspectives, but it took me like 6 months because I kept taking interesting little side notes or talking to people about other things here or there. So, yeah.
Yeah, understandable.
Okay, so I wanted to have you on to talk about these issues regarding Genesis and creation evolution. So the first obvious question is, what's the position you take on all this? I think that typically what I find is most people who are theistic Christians tend to fall into either something like young earth creationism, old earth creationism, or intelligent design, or something like theistic evolution. So which one of those do you take?
So I think a lot of Christians are afraid to say it, but I'm a theistic evolutionist, and I have no qualms about that. I accept the full theory of evolution, and I accept Genesis as well.
Okay. Well, that obviously leads into many different questions, but I think importantly, how do you define theistic evolution? Because I've read many people who actually don't at all mean the same thing when they talk about that.
Yeah, so a theistic evolutionist is one who accepts the full theory of evolution. So we accepted the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Animals evolved, humans evolved from lower primates, etc. So what you basically get with an intelligent design advocate is you'll get someone somewhere in the middle who says evolution never happened, but the Earth is old, versus someone who say all of the animals evolved, except maybe not humans. Whereas a theistic evolutionist goes one step further and says all the animals evolved that we have now, as well as humans. So I accept the full theory of evolution, as well as the account in Genesis, and I see them as completely compatible.
Okay. Well, yeah, that'll lead into some other questions I have here. But do you accept like a specific variant of evolutionary theory? Because I know typically what people are taught in schools is like Darwinian evolution, but there are other variants of it, which this can get a little technical, but I think it's important because I know some variations of evolution are not as readily plausible as some other ones are. So
Right. So there are different variations upon what biologists call the modern synthesis. And what the modern synthesis is what people typically think of when they think of evolution. It's neo-Darwinism. It's the idea that evolution happens through variations in gene frequencies. And what that means is a pair in the wild will get together and their offspring that they have, there will be variations in their genes. And through millions of years of that, that's how evolution occurs. That's the modern synthesis. I don't take that, but I also don't reject it. I say we need to hold to something called an extended synthesis. This is where we realize there are other driving factors in the evolution of life. And so what I tell people is I'm a structuralist. Now, what a structuralist basically is that we say the evolution of life was fine-tuned by natural laws. So if you were to rewind the tape of life back to zero and start over, according to a neo-Darwinist or a functionalist, sometimes that's what they're called, you may not get human life again. You may not get anything like it, because the way life could evolve is so random and varied that you could have gotten something totally different. A structuralist looks at other evolutionary mechanisms in the extended synthesis and says, well, if you rewind the tape of life back to zero and start over, evolution is so fine-tuned and constrained, you would get human life again. In fact, you'd get the same very similar type results. It may not be exactly as we are now, but you get something very similar to what we are now, and as well as the other forms of life. So we just say evolution is constrained by natural laws.
Okay, so if I'm understanding what you're saying, it would be similar to how like embryo development works, where once it gets going, as long as the embryo reaches completion, it's more or less going to be the same thing every single time, with a few minor variations here or there.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
Okay, interesting. All right. And so so you reject the other variants of evolution then, like you think would you think the neo-Darwin synthesis doesn't work because it needs more than just mutation and natural selection, or?
Well, I wouldn't say it doesn't work. I just say it's incomplete. There's obviously more driving forces in evolution.
Okay, yeah, I really like that, because this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things I've appreciated about a lot of intelligent design critiques is I think they're pointing out that the mechanisms that a lot of the neo-Darwinists point to don't really seem to account for everything that we see. That is, they account for some things, but not all. So I really like that you're saying, well, I want a version of evolution that has more, that can account for more things than just what neo-Darwin synthesis itself can. Okay.
Yeah, and if we have time later, I can talk about my critiques of intelligent design and why I don't hold to that view.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate that, because I've read some of that literature, and some of it I find pretty compelling. Obviously, some of it I don't, but that's okay. So I think the next question that a lot of Christians I know, like my dad's a young Earth creationist, so I know he would ask is, well, how do you then turn around and reconcile your theistic evolution view with Genesis, specifically like 1, 2, and 3, which is what you're doing a whole series on now? So.
Right. So I'll cover this in as short as I can. So basically, when we look at the Genesis account, we tend to think of it in our own modern terms. Like if the Bible was written in our culture, we would start with a material understanding of how the cosmos came to be. Then we impose that on this ancient culture that produced the Bible, and we think they would want to do the same thing. That's probably not the case, especially when we look at the surrounding culture and how other creation accounts were written. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So one of the things I'm pointing out in my series is when you start to look at Genesis 1 and 2 within its cultural context, they weren't really focusing on material creation. What they cared more about was pointing out that their God, Yahweh, was the supreme God above all other beings out there, that he took control of the cosmos. He ordered it. It was his to begin with. And so they're not really focusing on material creation. And I've had even young Earth creationists admit the aim of Genesis 1 is not to really explain how the cosmos came about. They'll say that's a part of it, but that's not the main message of it. And my point is, if it's not the main message, it's not necessary to posit in there. So one of the things I'm pointing out is that Genesis 1 is more of an account of God ordering and ordering the cosmos for his purposes, coming into it, saying the cosmos is now his divine temple. This is where he resides with his creatures. That's the main purpose. And there's a lot of clues to this in the text.
Okay. Well, I know this can get pretty complicated and in-depth, because I've read some books on people suggesting a similar view to what you're talking about. But like, what is some evidence of that in the text?
Well, let's just start with the very first verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A lot of people don't realize this, but that's probably not the way it reads in the Hebrew. The reason is because there's no definite article. There's a problem, is that the very first word of Genesis does not imply in the beginning. It more or less implies when. So really, you should read Genesis 1 like, when God began to bara, or create the heavens and the earth. Now, that changes something, because if you read Genesis 1 the way it is in every Bible, it's a complete sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if we realize how it reads in the Hebrew, you're going to read it like, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was formless and void. That means that when God showed up to bara, or create the heavens and the earth was already there, and it was formless and void. So that implies God comes in at a certain point in time and starts to order things, or assign proper functions, or elect the cosmos for a specific purpose. So that implies there's this unknown period of time prior to this that was already there.
Okay. And so I think naturally the question that like my dad and many other people would have would be, well, then aren't you kind of denying creation ex nihilo, which has kind of been the church doctrine for a long time, that God created the world out of nothing? Or are you trying to say, well, that's not what's going on in Genesis, but we can get creation ex nihilo somewhere else?
Exactly. The Bible does not end in Genesis 1. There are plenty of other passages which show this. There's places in Proverbs. John 1:1, for example, there's a place in Colossians as well that says God created everything. By the time you get to the New Testament, they're clearly talking about material creation, because they're writing in a post-Aristotle world. So they're using a lot of those terms and ideas, and they're borrowing terms from Greek thought. So they obviously agree that Yahweh created the heavens and the earth, but that's not really what's happening in Genesis 1.
Okay. And so what other examples would you, or evidence could you look to besides Genesis beginning with the when? And I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm not in a position to say, critique you on that. But what are some other evidences you would point to that that's what's going on?
Well, I tell people to look at a passage that's often missed. It's in Jeremiah 4. In this passage, Jeremiah is warning Judea that they're going to end up like the northern kingdom of Israel, that if they don't shape up and turn back to God, bad things are going to happen. But right in the middle, he uses language that's very reminiscent of Genesis 1. He says, if you don't shape up, you're going to be formless and void. There's going to be no light. There's going to be no man. There's going to be no birds of the air. There's going to be no vegetation. And it's weird, because even the very conservative scholars like John MacArthur will acknowledge this language is echoing Genesis 1. But when the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by Assyria, we don't think the sun literally stopped shining there. We don't think there was literally no more humans. They literally became formless and void. We understand that northern kingdom went from a functional state to a functionless state. So if that language describes, if that language is what is being described in Jeremiah 4, and the reverse is happening in Genesis 1, God says, let there be light. He turns it from something that's formless and void. He puts man and birds in the air. He allows vegetation to grow. That would imply that Genesis 1 is talking about God taking the cosmos from a functionless state to a functional state.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've heard, this view of Genesis you're espousing is sometimes called like a functional view, and not functional in the sense of practical, but in the sense of what you think Genesis 1 is describing there is God assigning function to various things which are, so to speak, already there. Is that more or less right?
So look at like what happens on day 4, is that God says that the sun and the moon will be for marking the seasons, the festivals, the days, this sort of language. Okay, well, that tells us right there that what God is doing is he's assigning functions to the heaven, to the sun and the moon. Prior to this, before human civilizations flourished, you didn't need to mark seasons and days and months and years. That only is needed for human civilizations to function properly.
Okay, interesting. Well, there's a lot of other ways we could go with this. So, from the research I've done, and I think I've watched a couple of your videos, this is the view that like John Walton takes of Genesis. Is that correct? Or
right? He's the most influential in my thinking on this. Now, he doesn't agree with me on the translation of Genesis 1:1, but the functionalist idea, the temple inauguration view of the 7 days, is a view that I got from him.
Okay. Now, I read one of his books. I know he's written many of them on this, but I read one of his books where he laid that out, and I remember thinking at the time that, well, this is kind of a coherent theory where you're saying this is written mostly as a polemic against the creation accounts of the other cultures that were around there, and the functionalist view is definitely coherent in the sense that you can fit it with the text. But then my thought was, but then how do we know that that's like the most appropriate way to interpret it? How do we know it was like intended as a polemic against those other cultures? So what would you say to that?
Well, there's actually a scholarly debate as if it is polemics against another culture, or if it just meets within its culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the writings of the French Revolution were not polemics against the American Revolution, although you can see similarities in there and you can see differences. It just fits with the culture of the time. If you look at both constitutions from that time period, a lot of their own letters of the founding fathers of both of those revolutions. So John Walton actually doesn't think that these are polemics.
There might
be implicit polemics, but there's no direct, explicit polemics. So it might just be a cultural idea of saying that Yahweh reigns supreme. And so other cultures would say, well, no, Marduk reigns supreme. Now, that's not necessarily polemic, but it might just be some sort of implicit polemic going on. You think your God reigns, really it's our God. And they're kind of just doing the same thing there.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can refine this question a little bit. I got my undergraduate degree in English, and one of the things I've learned there is that there's often multiple coherent interpretations you can make of text that fit within the text and which you can find evidence for. And so when I read the functionalist view that you're espousing and that John Welton is prominent for, I'm like, well, yeah, there's evidence for the text in that. It fits there. It's coherent. But then how do I decide between that and other views that fit with the evidence and are coherent? And what I would want to point to is, well, we need to look and find out what the authorial intention is, but with something like Genesis, that's very, very hard to do, where, like, say, with the French Revolution, you could usually find some other evidence as to what the author's intentions were.
Right. So the one of the things you have to look at, what is the point of the main author getting to?
Exactly,
Is Genesis 1 really ends in Genesis 2:3, because, it sort of concludes by mentioning the seventh day. So when we added chapter markers in the Middle Ages, we kind of missed that point. But so basically that's when it ends. And the conclusion is God taking residence within the cosmos, or resting sort of like in the cosmos that he has just functioned or created. If that's the ending, if that's the finale, then that shows you what the main purpose was. It was pointing out that God is the one who's reigning supreme over the cosmos. It doesn't end with God saying, and then he built this, or then he realized that, this work was, this material structuring was done. What the authors want to get to is noting that God is reigning or taking up residence within his cosmic temple. So that would imply that's the main aim of what the authors are trying to get at and trying to point out. And that's one of the things John Walton draws on. That's what they're trying to get to. Their main aim is to show that God rules. It's not to show how material forms came about.
So it would be kind of like if you could, in some stories, say the end of the story is the point. And since that's the end of the story, then we can say that's the point. Therefore, we should read the rest of the story in light of that. And that gives us at least a clue of the author's intention. Is that more or less right?
Basically, that's kind of what you're getting at. So, just think of a lot of the stories that people try to reinterpret today in sort of cultures. Well, we know that, if we're going to, I've seen this online randomly, like people try to reinterpret like things like Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks and the Three Bears into feminist literature. That was never its intent. So just because you could interpret it that way, we got to try to get back to what culture was written on and what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. That was one of the things I found troubling when I was getting my English degree, is people would go back and read Shakespeare and try and do second and third wave feminist interpretations of that. And I'm like, well, maybe you can make it fit, but come on. Shakespeare was not a second or a third wave feminist. That's ridiculous. So,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, some I know, anyhow, I think that's good. And some theistic evolutionists I know will write off the first couple of chapters of Genesis as entirely mythological. So why don't you do that? Why do you then turn around and look for and say, yeah, this is stuff it's describing things that really happened. There's evidence for it.
Well, that's a modern category. This idea of myth, or this idea of legend, or this idea of historical. These are modern categories we have for our text. Ancient authors didn't really have these exact categories. They could intertwine different ideas. Like if we read Genesis 2:24 about a man shall leave his father and mother and join to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. We understand that as a metaphor. It's myth in some sense. Humans don't really join together at marriage. It's not literal in that sense. So you can see them sort of backing and forth. They would use metaphors or archetypal patterns, or you could call it myth, to describe real events and real people. What ancient authors did is they would look to the past, events that happened, and interpret the theological meaning in that. So this is what they did with Judges, the book of Judges. It covers a vast time period. In this time period, Ramesses has a battle with the Hittite Empire. And it's not mentioned in Judges, probably because the authors didn't see Yahweh acting in that, or couldn't find theological significance in that. So they would just look to the past and look for certain events, battles, scenes, and then talk about the theological significance of those events. So when I read Genesis 1 through 11, I see the Hebrew authors looking to their past and looking for theological significance in oral traditions that were handed down to them or past events, and just they're talking about the theology of those events. That's what they're basically doing.
So would it then be fair to say it's like they're not really concerned about doing history in the sense that a contemporary historian is, but they're also not like just making things up, writing mythology that they don't know is absolutely not true. They're doing something that's a bit more loose and fluid than what we would typically want to write things today.
Right. I wouldn't know. I don't know if I would use loose and fluid maybe, because that might have a different meaning when you talk about oral traditions. But they're not doing, so a lot of we as modern Westerners, we want to put everything in a category. It's got to be a myth. It's got to be history.
Yeah.
And so they look at Genesis 1, they see, well, there's clearly mythological themes they're using. I mean, they talk about Leviathan sometimes, they talk about certain ideas that we see in other cultures that qualify as myth. But those categories didn't exist in the ancient Near East. They intertwined both to talk about a real history here, and they would interpret history in theological ways. So they would really be more interested in the theological implications of a story. And so that's what they focused on. So when we get to the flood account, it's all about how humanity has sinned and God needs to start over with this family with Noah. So they're talking about this historical event in their eyes that happened, but they're more focused on what that meant theologically.
Okay. So it's not so much that they're unconcerned with the fact that this event actually happened. It's that they're more concerned with, well, what did it mean? What was God doing through it? Rather than giving us details about this is how much rain came down in the flood. This is exactly to the second how long it lasted, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, I know you've done a lot of work as far as like why you think Genesis like 1 through 11 is reliable. So what's some stuff you could point to there? And I know you've also got some other stuff on YouTube you could point people to for more information on that. So
yeah, on the Apologetics Academy YouTube channel, I recently did a presentation called The Reliability of Genesis 1 to 11. And so I went through a lot of that data. It was an hour-long presentation, so obviously I can't get to all that. But you got to think of thinking in terms of external evidence. Recently, satellite data over the Persian Gulf has noted that the description of that land that used to actually be land before it was filled with water because it flooded at some point, hint, it actually fits with the description of the land of Eden. You had the Euphrates and the Tigris flowing into one river that flowed through a habitable land at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Two other rivers flowed in. One came from ancient Arabia, which in the ancient time was called Havilah, where there was gold. Another river flowed through the Zagros Mountains, which was the original home of the Kaziites. So it may be the original home of Cash, because ancient Hebrew didn't have vowels. So we say there was a Gihon river that flowed through the land of Cush, but it could have been Cash. So there was an archaeologist named Jeffrey Rose who wrote a paper called the Gulf Oasis. And he noted this land beneath the Persian Gulf was like a paradise. They had very little rain, yet they had a lot of water, a lot of lithic raw materials, abundance of food. Well, that kind of sounds like Eden. And he noted even after he wrote this paper in interviews that he was trying to ignore the connections to Eden when he wrote the paper. But now it's so obviously Eden. It's hard to even ignore because it just fits so well with the description.
Okay, that's amazing. When did that research come out?
So the paper was published in 2010. And in the paper, he says that the Persian Gulf slowly flooded. Well, later papers came out and argued that it rapidly flooded.
Hmm. Which I'm assuming would then be evidence for the flood.
Exactly. Now, it's
Mhm.
not, I don't argue for a global flood. I think it's a regional flood that happened throughout Arabia, throughout ancient Sumer. And we do actually have a lot of archaeological evidence that there was some sort of deluge, some sort of flood that happened about maybe 6,000 to 13,000 years ago, somewhere in there. This area rapidly flooded, reshaped the geography, and heavily affected human civilizations or human tribes and groups living there.
Okay, good deal. So they found like settlements that were buried in a lot of human settlements that were then buried in like a lot of sediment and things along those lines, I'm imagining then.
Well, not really because it's all underwater. But what we have
Ah.
found is that there is a lot of evidence that human cultures were reshaped around this time.
Hmm.
There was a lot of changes within the geography of that region. So when God said He destroyed the land, He really did destroy the land and reshape it.
Okay, okay. And how would you then, I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, but I'll ask anyway. How would you reconcile that with the fact that Genesis says the flood was like over the whole of the earth and over all the mountains and things along those lines?
Yeah, so no one takes the entire flood account literal. It's impossible. In Genesis 8, God says He opens the windows of heaven, or He closes the windows of heaven. Okay, no one thinks there's literally windows in the sky.
Hmm.
God says He's going to make an end to all life. Okay, He didn't. God said that the water receded from the whole earth, or it didn't recede from the whole earth. I mean, it's still, well, obviously, we still have water. So
Yeah.
no one takes this entirely literal to begin with. So don't sit here and tell me you take the flood account literally. You don't. No one does. And so then we have to start looking at ancient Near Eastern concepts, the idea of hyperbole, the idea of their visual perspective, and actually how it fits. So a lot of scholars will note it fits just fine with a regional flood.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought you were going to say. So, yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there. There's definitely a lot of metaphors that go on in Scripture, and what I've found is you just need to have some kind of more of a basis for determining, well, when is it a metaphor? When is it that it's the windows of heaven being opened? Okay, it's going to rain a lot, as opposed to, no, there really is a window in heaven, which that one is quite obviously a metaphor, but I think there's some other ones where it's not quite as clear.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Okay. Well, do you have any other evidence or interesting things there you can point to?
I mean, there's a lot of interesting internal evidence that would suggest that it's an older account.
Hmm.
So you can think of something like the term Havilah. Havilah is the same name for Arabia. Now, if you look at every time Havilah shows up in Scripture, it all appears in the older work. So it shows up in Genesis, it shows up in Samuel. And then all of a sudden, around the time of Solomon, in the biblical text, they start calling it Arabia. So that seems to
Hmm.
correlate with different time periods. The ancient people called this term Havilah, but then the later authors called it Arabia. So you have that. The descriptions of the serpent in Genesis 3 seem to match old pyramid texts from the old kingdom of Egypt, which predates Abraham.
Hmm.
So there's interesting points like that. I mentioned earlier how Jeremiah seems to refer to the creation account. Well, there's Jeremiah 4 specifically. Well, there's other
Hmm.
passages like in Job or in like Ezekiel and Isaiah that seem to reference or allude to what's happening in Genesis. So it would imply that they already understood these accounts and that these accounts already existed in their time period. So that suggests it's older than like when they were writing. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
interesting points of evidence along the way that you could use to make those types of arguments.
Okay. And there was one thing I heard you talking about with somebody else a while back, where you were talking about why you think the ages of the patriarchs might not necessarily be literal, and that was a debate you were doing, which unfortunately the other guy in the debate was not very wasn't a good debate, but that wasn't on you, that was on him. So would you mind talking about that a little bit, because I thought that was interesting too. So
Yeah, so one of the points I brought up was so we tend to read these ages of patriarchs and we go, well, it says he lived to 900. I guess he really did.
yeah.
But we know that's scientifically impossible today. No one can live
Hmm.
to that age, even if you eat the most perfect healthy diet. So that people sort of struggle with this. Well, there's some interesting indications within the biblical text that would imply these ages were never meant to be literal. So if the ages are literal, Abraham was born to a guy that was 130 years old, Terah. That's
Hmm.
allegedly when he lived to when he had Abraham. However, Abraham talks about how he can't have a kid in his old age. And that's very interesting because at one point he laughs and he goes, shall a man who is 100 bear a child? Shall Sarah, who is 90, bear a child? No, if the ages were literal, he should have been like, well, of course I'll bear a child after the age of 100. I mean, my father did. But no, he thinks it's impossible for someone at the age of 100 to bear a child. So that would make a contradiction if the ages are literal. So a lot of scholars have noted that the ages of Genesis 5 correlate with a base 60 counting system. This was used in ancient Sumer. So we count with a base 10 system because we have 10 fingers. They used a base 60. This is where we get 360 degrees in a circle, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. And so the ages of Genesis 5 correlate with a base 60. They're divisible by 60. Sometimes you have to add a multiple of 7. Not really a hard issue. It correlates with biblical texts using the sacred number 7. So that shows up frequently. But that would also show the ages of Genesis 5 seem to correlate to an older time period, the Sumerian time period when they were more relying on the base 60 system. Because later ages, like the reigns of the kings during the divided monarchy, doesn't correlate to that. It correlates to a literal base 10 system. So that represents probably an older tradition that goes back even further when they were actually more utilizing the base 60 system.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess the only way I would maybe slightly quibble with you there is I'm not sure that the Abraham and his father example is quite a strict contradiction in the sense of one saying it is this way and the other one saying it is not this way, but it would definitely count as a problem for taking them literally, because then you're left with, well, why did Abraham laugh when his dad had him older? But I don't think it's quite a strict contradiction in the sense of like saying that person's a married bachelor or something crazy like that.
Well, that's fine. I'm more talking in terms of probabilistic.
Oh yeah. It's definitely evidence in favor of saying these aren't meant to be taken literally in a probabilistic sense. That's absolutely true. Okay. Okay. Well, let's move on a little bit. Why do you take evolutionary theory? Why is that the position you take? What do you find compelling about it, or what evidence or arguments have convinced you? And I know this could be a big topic, so we might have to gloss over it, but.
Yeah, so I used to be a young Earth creationist, and I decided one day that I was going to really listen to the evolutionist side, because if I was going to address their arguments, I should really know their view. And coming to know their view, I became pretty convinced of it. I tried to do the same thing with arguments against God's existence, and I became utterly convinced that they were horrible. But when it came to the theory of evolution, there was a lot of evidence there that I think a lot of creationists, intelligent design advocates overlook. One of the major things against young Earth creationist view that really convinced me was the fossils themselves. So we don't use fossils to date rocks. We don't use rocks to date fossils. That's a straw man misrepresentation you get from a lot of young Earthers. Really, we date different rock layers using things like radiometric dating, like potassium-argon dating, argon-argon dating, radium-235 dating. We have all these different dating methods that date the rock layers, and they keep lining up to get to the same time periods. Ironic. Okay, but then the fossils in there seem to correlate with the fossils in each of these rock layers that correlate with the different time periods, also correlate with the progression and change. So we don't find modern humans in rock layers with Australopithecus. We don't find Australopithecus in rock layers with dinosaurs or archosaurs or the Permian age. It all seems to line up to show this gradual progression. If Homo sapiens were created with Australopithecus, then we need to find a rock layer where they show up together. And it doesn't. What we find is exact time periods lining up with the slow progression. Australopithecus precedes Homo habilis, which precedes Homo erectus, which precedes modern-day humans. It's an odd coincidence if these were all created at one point and then they were sort of put in specific rock layers by a global flood. Gee, what an odd coincidence.
Yeah, so what you're saying there is the ages of the rocks that we find independently more or less match up with the ages of the fossils that we find independently, and that's a correlation that you wouldn't expect unless that was something like the evolutionary timeline was what was actually going on.
Right, and it just seems like a simpler explanation than positing that, one of the things I've heard young Earth creationists doing is say that, well, when the flood happened, the really dumb animals got buried first, and then some of the animals went halfway up the hill. This is something Ken Hovind has said. And I'm like, so the kangaroos got away to the top of the hill, but the dinosaurs got halfway up the hill. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But this is something he has said in a seminar. I'm like, wow, that's not how animals work.
That is one of the most ad hoc explanations I've ever heard. I just yesterday finished recording a podcast on why conspiracy theories are almost always wrong, and that's a very great example of a bad type of reasoning that you tend to get in more conspiracy theories. So,
Yes.
okay, what are there other arguments or points that have convinced you that evolution is the right way to go, or something like the right way to go?
Sure. I mean, think of like human chromosome 2. So most chromosomes have telomeres on each end. Well, there's a
Hmm.
rare occurrence where human chromosome 2 has two telomeres fused together in the middle. And ironically, it lines up with the the chimpanzee chromosomes. They have one extra chromosome, and if you take their two extra and you fuse them together, you get something that looks pretty similar to human chromosome 2. Again, a very odd coincidence that God would do that if this was all intelligently created from a design perspective. It seems far more likely God fine-tuned via natural laws than fine-tuned through supernatural laws. And that's something you see, like the telomeres that fuse together. That would be representing a natural change that would have happened there.
Okay, interesting. Um, I forgot what I was going to. Oh, well, I was going to say, yeah, I agree with you on definitely on the age of the the age of the fossils and the rocks and things. Like I've been to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, the Harvard Natural History Museum, and they've got rocks there that are 2 or 3 billion years old. It's really amazing. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's pretty cool. So that definitely is one thing that I used to be a young Earth creationist as well, but that's definitely one thing that convinced me that no, this world is definitely a lot older than 6 to 10,000 years because there's all this evidence lying around that indicates it is. And so if you're going to claim it is pretty young, you then have to turn around and claim that God made it. That God made it appear as if it's a lot older than it really is, and that kind of turns God into a, a liar or deception, and that's not what God is at all. So,
Right, and it's not even necessary
hmm.
to posit that when you read Genesis.
Okay. Well, any other things that more or less convinced you about why evolution is right?
I mean, also there's fossil genes, like there's genes in our genome that would uh, be used for creating this idea of vitamin C synthesis. Or so we could create our own vitamin C within our body, but our ancestors developed a high fruit vegetable type diet when they were living in the trees. When they were living in the trees, so they
Hmm.
no longer needed to keep making their own vitamin C because they kept getting it from a high food source. But we still have that in our genome, so it represents an ancient time when our ancestors would have needed that, and eventually we stopped using it. But it's still there. It's a fossil gene.
Okay. Um, yeah. In fact, that reminds me of something that I've been thinking about for a while now. That there's certain things that I've observed in trends in human diet and like the way we think about anxiety, where I'm like, well, that seems to be better explained by an evolutionary account than any other accounts. Like the fact that um, a lot of people are now doing diets where they like eat a lot more protein and fats and less grains, and then they like fast for a day or two. Which, well, if we evolved as hunter-gatherers, where you might have to starve for a day and you're not going to be eating agriculture, it makes sense that that diet would actually be pretty healthy because that's what our bodies evolved to do. And about a year or two ago, when my wife was pregnant with our second child, she observed that she was really anxious all the time. Noises in the night would really disturb her, and we talked about it a little bit and thought, from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes a lot of sense because when you're a pregnant woman, well, there's a chance a bump in the night might be something that's coming to kill you, and a chance it might be. But if you're living out in the jungle or on the Serengeti or something, the cost when you get it wrong is very, very high because you'll die and your child will die. You can't get it wrong. So it makes a lot more sense evolutionarily for you to be very anxious and to overreact to everything because the one time you don't overreact and it really is like a tiger coming to kill you, that's horrific. But since nowadays almost nothing that's a bump in the night is actually going to come and kill us, it's just really annoying. So,
Right, right. We're still very much in that time period. I remember also reading some articles on how certain humans in certain areas could digest foods better. So if you're of Japanese descent, you can digest seaweed better. So a
mm,
lot of times when European people eat, sushi, they're not really digesting the seaweed as well as someone with Japanese descent could. Now, if you're a Northern European, you are really good at digesting milk and milk products, especially type 1 cow milk. Uh,
mm.
But a lot of people that are in Japan or China have a hard time digesting that because their ancient cultures didn't rely on a lot of dairy products. But if you're living in Northern Europe, when you don't have a lot of vegetables in the winter, you got to rely on dairy products. So you could sort of see how different people evolve certain ways to digest certain foods better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My ancestors were probably a bunch of Vikings, and I use heavy cream in my coffee, not not even skim milk or something. So, okay.
Right.
Yeah. I've always thought that particular, well, not always, but recently thought that particular line of evidence is interesting because most of the time when I think about these things, I kind of come down on the other side and think that's not really good evidence. But in those cases, I think that there's probably something there. Okay. Well, if you're comfortable, why don't we move on? And why don't you tell me what your critiques of intelligent design theory are? Because I've read some of their literature, and I sent you notes so you know what I'm talking about here. And I found that a lot of, at least from what I've read, a lot of their critiques against the mechanisms of evolutionary processes seem to be pretty good to me. In that, there's a lot of critiques people make, and some of them are just dumb, like the ones you were citing from Kent Hovind or Hogan. Is his name Hovind or Hogan?
Hovind.
Hovind. Okay, yeah. But when guys like Stephen Meyer or Douglas Axe will then turn around and say, well, no, there's mechanistic problems here where even if I give you everything evolution says, mutation and natural selection just can't get us where we need to go. So we can talk about this in as much detail as we need to, but what's your general critique and why don't you buy into those ideas?
So my main problem is they have a narrow scope of what evolution is. They're very good at showing how the modern synthesis cannot explain these things. But evolutionary biologists working in the field have known this for decades now. We understand that modern synthesis needs to update. There's more mechanisms in evolution. So a lot of what the intelligent design advocates do is they attack like ideas of evolution that have been outdated since like the 1960s or so. Mm-hmm. They're very good at showing this. But it's kind of like they have spent really well figuring out how to defeat Napoleon, showing up on the battlefield with a strategy to defeat an army from that time period, and the evolutionary biologists show up with tanks and bazookas going, what did they prepare for? That's the problem, is that we have moved past that. Like, for example, Barbara McClintock showed that there are stress-induced evolutionary changes, that if an organism is put into an environment that is very straining or strenuous on the environment, that rapid changes can occur in a much quicker time period. So the organisms have this inbuilt mechanisms that if they're put into a stress-induced environment, they will change pretty rapidly to adapt. So it's not all gradual, slow mutations over a long period of time. There are other mechanisms driving evolution that can change and affect organisms in different ways.
Okay. Yeah, I really like that because I've kind of held the view for a while, which I thought was pretty unconventional, that a lot of aspects of evolutionary theory are more or less true. Like the general idea that if you go back 2 billion years, you find simple life forms. You go back 700 million years, you start finding early dinosaurs and so on and so forth. But the mechanisms that they taught me in school of mutation and natural selection just don't work to get us all that. And I've thought that seems to me to be very, very clear when I've thought about it and then dug more into the research on it, that mechanism alone just doesn't explain all these things. There has to be something else going on, whether you want to then turn around and say, oh, it's God guiding it, or even some other natural process.
Yeah, there's a website called The Third Way, and it's run by evolutionary biologists who are arguing against neo-Darwinism, but they're also arguing for evolution. And this is from their mission statement. They say, neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes, such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, action of mobile DNA, and epigenetic modifications. Moreover, some neo-Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without a real empirical basis. So they note there's all these other different processes which can drive and cause evolution. It's not just gradual changes over time.
Okay. Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I've been looking for and thinking about for a while. So then it would seem to me more of the problem is that the general public perception of evolution is more in line with mutation and natural selection. That's for whatever reason, the work these biologists and evolutionary biologists are doing, where they're trying to find these other mechanisms and explore them, isn't getting out to people who are talking about these things for whatever reason.
Yes, because we're still trying to. I mean, you see, Richard Dawkins has gotten kind of famous, and he's a strong advocate that it's mostly still the modern synthesis. There may be some. There's obviously epigenetics. There's obviously some horizontal gene transfer, but he's one of the proponents that of the selfish gene, of the idea that it's still the modern synthesis that's the main driving force.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of evolutionary biologists, like from James Shapiro, Dennis Noble, Eugene Koonin, have been arguing that that is a mechanism, but it's not the main one, and there's plenty of other ones. A lot of the research coming out now is arguing that organisms can modify their genomes if necessary. So the genomes, create the organism, but the organism can then turn around and modify their own genomes if they're in specifically constrained or stress-induced environments. So it's not so much that we're dancing through our DNA; it's that we're doing a duet. The organism and the DNA are dancing together and modifying each other.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating because, I sent you notes with a lot of these intelligent design critiques, and you basically I don't even need to go through them because you're kind of effectively sidestepping them, because they're critiquing the view that it's all mutation, natural selection, and saying that's impossible, that can't get us there. And you're saying, yeah, I know, there's all these other things too.
Right, and that's what I gave the analogy before. It's like them showing up to a battlefield prepared for 17th century warfare, and we're showing up with like jet planes and bazookas and tanks, and it's like, what did you guys come prepared for? We know this is not the way to fight a war. Recently, there was a paper this year the title of the paper was Direct Prebiotic Pathways to DNA Nucleosides. And what they are arguing is that there's a lot of self-assembly processes in nature that could give rise to DNA just as a result of natural processes. It doesn't need to come about from random chance. Nature might be fine-tuned to bring about DNA as an inevitable result. And this paper is evidence towards that view.
Oh, what is the evidence they cite in that? That'd be very interesting, yeah.
The title of the paper is Direct Prebiotic Pathways to DNA Nucleosides. And they argue there's different self-assembly processes in nature that just give rise to DNA nucleosides. So they show up in natural prebiotic world there. And other self-assembly processes could be discovered in the future that could show how they could form DNA. But this is a reoccurring thing that keeps happening in abiogenesis. We keep finding more and more self-assembly processes. You know how snowflakes sort of form through self-assembly? They're not random chance. It's nature sort of fine-tunes them to create these interesting-looking crystals. Well, there's a lot of self-assembly processes that we keep finding that was in the prebiotic world that sort of brought about a lot of the basic building blocks of life. And this is another paper demonstrating that.
Okay, so that's where I'm ending Michael's and I's discussion for this week. As is so often the case when I do these interviews with people, it went a bit too long to just put in one podcast, so I'm splitting it up here, and I'll air the second part of that next week. In the meantime, let me know what you think. What do you think of Michael's evidences for evolution? Do you find them compelling or not, and why? What do you think of my observations that certain things with anxiety and the human diet seem to lend themselves as support to kind of a evolutionary story as to how humankind originated? Again, let me know what you think. And what do you think of his critiques of ID theory? I personally found it very, very interesting how he's more or less saying that, yeah, the ID critiques are pretty valid, but they're only for this outmoded and outdated variant of evolutionary theory that pretty much everybody in the know already knows is wrong anyway. So I thought that was a pretty interesting, good response. I'm going to be thinking about it and doing some research myself. So write in, and as I keep saying, let me know what you think. I'd love to get more feedback. So you can reach me for any kind of comment or question at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. You can find the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. Leave any kind of a comment there. Always happy to see them. And if you like this content, you like what I'm doing on the podcast, share it on your social media and give it likes or reviews or ratings, whatever's appropriate on the podcast app you use, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, Castbox, whatever. If you're aware of any podcast service or app that the Examined Life with Phil isn't hosted on, let me know and I'll look into that. As far as I know, we're on all the major ones that I'm aware of anyway. So thanks again for listening this week, and I'll be back with the second part of Michael and I's discussion next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.